And my name is Dirk Coleman-Durr, and I work with some really great companies to help them put the people that matter most to their businesses, their consumer, their shopper, their guest, at the center of important business decisions. And I do that primarily by using consumer and market insights. And so I grew up over at Procter and Gamble and was there for about 10 years. Worked a lot in consumer and market research. A lot of it was focused on new product development and introducing new to the world products. I left there and went to Fifth Third and managed their marketing analytics and research department for a few years before going over to Nielsen. And so, if you're familiar with Nielsen, it's a company that works with clients to help them understand what people watch and what people buy. And so I played a variety of leadership roles there and had the opportunity to really start doing my own consulting a few years ago and really love conversations like this and being able to engage with a very different audience. One of the things before I kind of dive into all of the content here, I will give you one confession is that I have worked on lots of worked lots of different companies, worked with a lot of different teams globally. I've spent my entire adult career here in Cincinnati, and I have done very little to date to interact with our startup community. And that's a huge miss on my part. I see all the great things that I've sat in on webinars that Pete and John and others have put on. And it's always in the back of my mind, like, this is really great work that all of you are doing. And shame on me for not finding some way to get involved. So I connected with John sometime earlier this year and just said, let me know if there's anything I can do to help out. So John, it's funny you bring that up. We'd like to do some of these learning sessions, and one of them really focused on understanding how do you put the consumer at the center of some of these important business decisions. So today I want to talk a little bit about my observations on how companies do a really great job, and some of them do a poor job of building a consumer-centric culture. Like, what does that really mean, and how can you think about that a little bit? Some tips on listening to your consumer. So how do you start to bring them in? How do you really start to live this idea of, like, how do I bring the voice of the consumer into important business decisions? How do we gather some of these insights? I am not going to spend, because it's a pretty diverse group and we're short on time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about individual tools or methodologies or vendors, but I want to give you an understanding, kind of a lay of the land, and how you might make decisions when faced with how do I gather these insights. And then I also want to touch on some of the mistakes that I see people make and how you might prioritize. And I'm going to try to focus my attention here for people that are really playing in the startup space. So there might be some different recommendations if you're a more mature company, a larger company, but hopefully these things will resonate with our audience here today. So if you've been around here in Cincinnati, then you may have heard this term, like this mantra of consumer is boss. This is something that they talk a lot about at Procter and Gamble. Many people preach this, but what does it really mean to kind of put your consumer at the center of important business decisions? And what does it mean to kind of bring that to life? So it's something that I've observed, and it's just that as I'm working with clients or working with different businesses, there's a few things that strike me, and I just wanted to kind of put them in your mind as well. Is that when I first engage with a client, a lot of times I will ask them, like, well, what do you call these people that you're interacting with? Are they your consumers? Are they your shoppers? Are they your guests? And many people have a very thoughtful response to that. But you'd be surprised the number of people that say, well, I don't know, like, our sales team, they call them shoppers. Our marketing team, they call them consumers. They're kind of like guests, but I don't really know. That if you don't have a clear explanation on who these people are, if you don't have a clear way of referring to them, then I think it says a lot about the time that you're spending thinking about the consumer. And throughout my discussion here, I'm going to talk about consumers, but the insights that I'm talking about and the work that you can do, they're very portable if we're talking about customers or clients in a B2B space, if we're talking about users, if we're looking at people who are interacting with consumer packaged goods, if we're talking about people who are buying durable or luxury items or services, a lot of what you find here, there are certainly important differences between all those categories that I just mentioned, but there are some common threads that tie them all together. And so, what I've tried to do in our discussion here today is really hit on some of those principles that we can apply regardless of who these people are that you are interacting with in your business. Another thing that I see, and I encourage you to look at this within your enterprise, is how do you respect the consumer when they're not watching? And as somebody who earns my living doing consumer and market research primarily, I spend a lot of time doing things like consumer focus groups or qualitative research, helping execute surveys and so forth. And a lot of times I will sit in a qualitative research session. So you think about a focus group, sometimes you're watching consumers talk about your product or service either by a video or behind a one-way mirror. And I'm surprised sometimes when people who are like they're in business today because of the people that are sitting on the other side of that screen, and how glib or discounting we can be of their opinion or something that they might say. So I've sat through qualitative research where, oh, I don't know, but maybe if we're selling toothpaste, we have consumers, oh, why did you select that brand of toothpaste today? Consumer might say, well, mom always bought that brand, and so that's the brand that I always buy. And inevitably, there'll be somebody in the back of the room be like, can you believe that? Like, how disengaged are they? They don't really understand our category. This is so frustrating, so forth and so on. And in fact, they're telling you something really important about your business, your brand. And they're also a lot of times telling you something that is very reasonable and logical about how consumers interact with your category. But I think that's something that as you think about the tone within the organization, how you talk about consumers, keep that in mind. And I think you can really tell a lot about a company. It's kind of almost like a little bit of a litmus test around how you speak about your consumer. And the same goes for your client in the B2B space. And it's something where I think for many of us who work in that space, we've all had clients that have been challenging or frustrating and so forth. But is that client your boss or not? And how you talk about them when they're not on the phone, when they're not in the room, I think says a lot about the organization. And the last piece is, and I think this is something that many of you may see as well, is that how do you deal with complications when they arise? And that's one of those points that I think you see that we can all talk about these principles. We can all say that we value our consumer and that these are the most important people to us. But what happens when you miss your quarterly numbers, or what happens when you get some bad results back from the new run of product that you're going to have to do a recall or something like that? Is the first thing that comes to your mind really like, how do I do right about my consumer? How do I make sure that I am putting them first when I'm dealing with a really tough decision? And so I think you can tell a lot, and really many times this is where the rubber hits the road, and you can really tell where people are bringing this to life. The, so as we think about like, how do you start to put the consumer first, and how do you start to think about translating the insights that you might have about your consumer into decisions that you're making? Now, I would challenge you a little bit to think that every one of your business questions has an analogous consumer insight or consumer question that you should also be asking. So when you think about planning for year one sales, you're launching a new product. And so you should always start with, what is that business question? But then to be able to understand that, you want to understand how appealing is your concept? How appealing is this product? What can you do to improve your marketing effectiveness? Well, do people actually remember my ad? And what does that ad mean to them? So these are important business questions that we're able to translate into a consumer insight to be able to inform those questions. So even things like, should I sponsor the West End Stadium? Things like that there are a variety of pieces of information on your business go into making that decision, but the voice of the consumer should be a part of that. And so I think that as you're sitting down to tackle these important business questions, having this where you are starting to hardwire thinking in your organization to say, okay, well now what is the analogous consumer question, is something that's really important to do. I'll give you one example from some work that I did recently with a client. So I was working with this is a a startup beauty care company out in California, and they've been growing leaps and bounds. It's double digit year on year growth, and they've been able to sustain that now for about 3 years. And they're hitting a place in their business where they have some decisions to make on within their product supply. And right now they're using a co-packer, and they could bring all that production in house. And so they're asking that very foundational question for their business as they look at 2021, like should they bring that production in house or not? And so at first blush, I think a lot of times when we look at a question like this, we say, well, clearly there are important financial implications to that. There are important product supply, availability, and distribution questions that we're going to answer in that. But it sometimes is not intuitive as to like why does a consumer matter in a question like this? So when I see a question like this, there's some immediate consumer questions that start to fall out of that business question. So, are there reasons to believe that consumer behavior is going to change? So, they've seen this phenomenal growth. And the real question is okay, if I bring that production in house, if I make some capital expenditure to be able to do that, am I going to stay on that glide path or am I plateauing or what have you? In particular, as they were looking at this last year, they were still seeing pretty dramatic growth in spite of the pandemic. And so they wanted to better understand would that continue. What do they know about their consumer behavior once the consumers already tried the product? And are they repeating purchase? Are they continuing to buy this product? And then do consumers notice any difference? So they were talking about this, and there were going to be some differences in the packaging and differences potentially even in the product or the substrate going in the package. And did that matter or not? And so these are important consumer questions that would help to inform this business question. So working with them, they actually had quite a bit of the information that they already needed to be able to answer some of these questions. So things like understanding habits and practices. They had subscribed to some reports within their industry to understand what consumer behavior was looking like during the pandemic. So giving them some confidence that a lot of their business is in kind of the DTC space. So they felt really good about that. And that was a piece of their business that was growing. And they feel that that's something that will continue to be sustained into the year. Looking at sales data that they would be able to acquire. So some of this, and I'll touch on this here in a moment, but some of the syndicated sales data, it can be directly from companies like IRI or Nielsen or Spins or others. But they also can acquire some of this information directly from some of their retail partners. So without going out and spending a whole lot of money, they had a pretty good sense of some of the sales data and understanding through things like looking at how people transact on loyalty cards and so forth, getting a sense of what the purchase dynamics were in their category. And then actually doing some product testing. And they had done a little bit of this in a technical environment, but then also placing some of this product with consumers to see if there were some noticeable differences. So all of these are starting to lay out this framework of how do you start with this business question and drive it into some consumer questions, and then how do you translate those or gather some of those insights. So when you start to piece this together, what I would encourage you all to do is that before, a lot of times what we have this tendency to do is it's kind of pass go and jump into these tools or methodologies. So, and this is coming from somebody who has spent a lot of time in my career working on selling tools and methodologies. But I think a lot of times when you look at consumer research that people are interacting with, they've been sold something by a supplier, and maybe it's really great research, or maybe it's work that they can have a really big impact on their business, but they were a little bit, sometimes the company has been a little bit passive in deciding, like, why did I buy this particular product or methodology? And a lot of times it was, well, somebody was a really strong salesperson, knocked on my door, and that's why I bought it. But what I would encourage you to do is build out a specific learning plan for your business. And that's always starting with your business objective. And so that's one of those things that I'll stress as I'm going through our conversation here today, is that a lot of times you'll see people who are jumping into, well, I need to run this XYZ test, or I need to go get this consumer insight. Well, start with the business objective. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And then what is the associated research question that you need to answer? And I like going into anytime I'm doing this, like, what do you think the outcome's going to be? Like having a point of view on what you think the consumers are going to do. And then and then looking at that to understand, okay, based on that, what action am I going to take? So if I go and gather this information, if I knew what consumers thought about my new product, if I knew that they thought the new product was really appealing, well, what action would I take? If I knew that the consumers didn't like the new product, or that they thought that my competitor's product was better than mine, then what action would I take? But being able to understand the actionability of those insights is really important. And once you've kind of laid that out, only then should you start thinking about methodology or what it's going to cost or timing. So it's, I think these are like a fundamental principle that I see a lot of times people are missing, is that they're kind of skipping steps in this process and jumping right into, well, where can I go buy this particular insight, or how much is it going to cost me to get this, without doing this type of groundwork. A lot of times people also ask, like, where should I prioritize? If I'm thinking about gathering these insights, where should I prioritize? I'm gonna paint with a really wide brush here. And I'll say that I like to start and prioritize the fundamentals and foundational pieces, because a lot of this can impact many of the different business questions that you're tackling today. So understanding your consumer's path to purchase. So what are the decisions? What are the determinants on what they're putting in their shopping cart, what they're online or in retail, how they are making a decision between you and your competition, and then what are the challenges they might face to be able to get that product home, or to be able to incorporate your tool within their business. So understanding that path to purchase, and really working with your consumer, your client, your shopper to lay that out, I think is foundational, and it should be the starting point for your learning plan. Optimizing your concept is, I think, a really key question that many startups have and that many people are working through. And so what I'm talking about here is, when I refer to a concept, like, this is how you brief or bring together the different elements of your offering. So what is the actual product? What is the benefit of this? What need is it addressing to consumers? Why would they believe that this is something that they would want to incorporate in their life? How much is it going to cost? And how might it be positioned in terms of a product lineup? So a lot of just the foundational pieces of what the offering is. Well, spending some time thinking about these individual elements and how do you optimize those is a really good use of our time. And then the product usage experience. So really getting to know, how are people interacting with my solution, and what are they doing differently? What are the things that they're running into that are difficult? And how can I take that information to improve my product? Some of the things I see people jumping into, that I think it just from a priority standpoint, that you can wait on, or that maybe the first thing to jump out the gate. I see a lot of people tackling complex consumer segmentation research. And there's nothing wrong fundamentally with some of this research, but a lot of times it's really hard to action, and it's really easy to misinterpret. And so this is one where there's a lot of people out there that are selling really, really clever solutions to understand different segments of the marketplace. But before you ever go there, like, are you really understanding your total addressable market? Have you really cast a wide enough net? And a lot of this type of research, you just have to be careful, like, how actionable is it, and what does it really mean to me if I'm immediately jumping into slicing and dicing up the consumer audience into smaller and smaller groups and focusing my attention there. And it kind of ties in a little bit with marketing optimization, that I've spent a lot of my career working on marketing optimization, working on thinking about, how do we improve our marketing execution? How do we improve how we're thinking about positioning our message in the marketplace across different channels? That's a really important area to play. If you're in a startup space, that's an area where you probably need to prioritize other things first. And so it's probably a different conversation if you're spending, millions of dollars on advertising, than if you are purely in the upstream. I'm working on an alpha or beta product that is still some time for market. I mentioned before, I'm not going to go through every type of research and every type of study that we can execute. If you've interacted at all in this space, you've seen lots of different terms flying around. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a level set on the different variations of consumer research that are out there, and kind of thinking about how we triage this space. In my simple mind, I start to break things down into there's primary consumer research where you're gathering information directly from consumers. And so this can be in a qualitative setting where you're interacting with them one on one, or you're using someone else, a moderator or someone else, to interact with these. There's a lot of ethnographic research in this space. So going into people's homes and kind of seeing how they're using their product, going into their office and seeing how they're interacting with your solution, shopping along or sending people in to actually interact with that product. So someone going into the bank and seeing how people open their accounts, and that sort of thing. There's a really important way of gaining foundational insight into how people are interacting with your product and how people are interacting within the category. Quantitative research is when we're starting to scale that up and starting to think about, with a larger audience, how do we gather additional insight, and by doing so, how do we have more confidence in some of our conclusions. So qualitative research is really powerful and helpful as we think about understanding the language people use to talk about our products, or how they're thinking about that path to purchase, and starting to build hypotheses. Quantitative is when we're starting to cast a wider net with a larger group of people, where we can start to say, okay, well, I believe this to be true, and now if I go talk to 500, 1,000, 200 people, do I find that to be the case? And so there's lots of different variations of quantitative research to help you get more certainty and understanding of some of these insights. And then there's a whole area of secondary research. So things like sales data, online activity, or CRM, even things like, as I mentioned before, companies like Kantar or Nielsen or others do have a lot of information about people's interaction with media, and who that's reaching and so forth. So these other data streams that are really important to help us understand what's happening with our consumers and within our marketplace. So it's, when you're looking at these different methods, that's a lot of stuff that I hope the people on our call here today, you don't need to become an expert on the execution of market research or on all these different tools and techniques. That when someone is bringing you one of these solutions, or when someone is kind of interacting, or when you're thinking about different options that you might have available, the things that I always try to keep in mind is that every piece of research that you're doing, or any kind of insight that you're gathering, should meet one of two goals. It should either be about helping you manage some risk, or helping you optimize some outcome. And depending on the risk you're trying to manage, or depending on the opportunity that you think you can unlock, that helps us understand the types of tools that we want to use, and honestly, the level of investment that we want to make in some of this research. So I think that's one of those things. When I talked before about creating a learning plan, a lot of this is talking about the actions that you're going to take. So what are you going to do differently on your business if you had this piece of insight? So are you, when you think about risk management, are you making a large capital decision, or have you already made the decision to go to market? Like, these important business decisions will help inform what kind of consumer insight, what depth of insight do you need going forward. Um, just to share one example, as I mentioned before, I'm not going to talk through lots of different tools and techniques, or when we get to our chat here in a few minutes, I'm happy to go into some of these in a little bit more detail if there's specific areas that you're particularly interested in or passionate about. But you think about some of the ways that we understand sales potential of a new idea. And the way I think about this, it's all about managing risk through the innovation process, and as we think about bringing a new product to market. And many of you will probably think about the the qualification of your idea, or how you're thinking about bringing it to market differently depending on the category you're in and some of the decisions that you're making. But usually we're starting with understanding and ideating on that idea, and trying to establish what is the market size. So a lot of times what we're doing is we're both looking at information that we might have about a potential category, or something that we're going to be entering in, to understand, well, how large is that market potentially? What is the addressable market that I could go after? and then understanding how well will my product fit that, and a lot of like quick cycle and agile innovation in that space. You're then trying to screen down these ideas. So as you start to take something, like there are specific tools that you can start to look at to say, okay, I could go in 5 or 6 different directions, and which of these are more appealing to consumers. And so there's different tools that you can use to be able to understand and kind of screen down that concept and see just how powerful is this idea. What is the, do I have some sense of what the relative appeal of these ideas are? So maybe I'm not even getting to like a volumetric forecast, but I'm helping to understand that this is a really compelling idea, and why. So what are some of the drivers of that? What do people really like about it? What do people not like about it? And then you're trying to optimize and improve on that. So that's, again, we're looking at testing our product, we're looking at testing the concept further to be able to refine the language, to be able to refine our pricing, to be able to refine the SKUs or the offerings that we might want to have on the shelf. And that can get into some qualification testing. And again, a lot of this will depend on what are the decisions you're making along the way. The way you might qualify a new product to market looks very different for a capital intensive product than it does for a product that you can quickly change if you decide that you make a little, sell a little, and as you go. But I think that's where the tools that you're using really have to go back to an understanding of what is the risk that you're trying to manage as you're going to market. A couple of things that I'll touch on here are some of the common mistakes that I see people make, and I've learned some of these. I've skinned my knees in some of these myself, but these are things to kind of keep in mind as you're thinking about research you might interact with and how do you kind of drive these insights into action. So the first thing is that you can't ask the consumer to do your job for you. So going in and saying, well, how would you live your life differently with my new flying car? Or what are some other ideas of ways that I should change my product? What would you like to do? Like, it's really hard for a consumer to design your product for you. They can react to an idea. They can tell you. I think one of the things that's very powerful is consumers can tell you about the choices they might make if they see your idea and maybe another idea, but they really can't. It's not effective for you to ask them to say, okay, well, let's ask the consumer to kind of design this for us. And so you have to be careful in that space. The other area here is having focus, and that's one of the things that I find is having a thoughtful learning plan, where ahead of time you've already thought about, what is the insight that you need to gather? What do you think is the correct answer? What is your hypothesis about how the world works? And then how are you going to take an action once you gain that insight? So a lot of times what I'll see is that once people get the research back, or once people get some research back, then they start thinking about some of those questions, and you end up just kind of constantly churning and boiling the ocean. And so trying to have some discipline on the front end before you ever kick off a project or before you go out and seek these insights will save you a lot of time and a lot of organizational headaches downstream. Selective listening. We are all so invested and passionate about our businesses that it's sometimes hard to get bad news from our consumers. And be it qualitative research or quantitative research, we are always looking for the upside. And a lot of times, especially when we're in a startup environment, like we're trying to persuade investors that we are able to move to the next phase. And we're trying to really make sure we're out there hustling to make sure that we're able to kind of hit our milestones. And that's really important in work that we need to do. But when we're listening to our consumers, we need to kind of look through a different lens and try to be as objective as possible. And so not discounting their concerns or their frustrations or areas that we need to improve is something that is really important. With most of our quantitative research, there's some kind of significance testing or looking at what is and I won't bore you too much with the nuts and bolts of this, the stats behind it, but a lot of times we're looking at, okay, if I have 2 different groups of consumers and I see that one finds the idea more appealing than the other, but can I say that that's representative of what the entire market would say? Can I say that my piece of research is really representative of the entire market? So we look at that, we use statistics to help us understand that. So you end up with reports that a lot of times will have all of these little stats down through every way that we can slice and dice the data. And it's very easy just to look through a data table or look through some statistics and just kind of chase those that data on down through these different stats. And you need to always take a little bit of a step back and say, like, is this really meaningful? Like, if I say that this okay, that this seven on a page, 7% of consumers feel this way, as opposed to 4% on this other group feel a different way. And those are statistically different numbers. The seven and the four are different. But are those meaningfully different numbers in terms of the business action I'm going to take? And so I think those are important things to think about. And so it's sometimes we kind of lose sight of that for some odd reason. And especially when I talked about earlier, when we think about consumer segmentation, where we'll really get into this and say, well, this segment, this audience thinks my idea is really great and is much more appealing than this other audience. Well, how big is that audience? And how like just how much more appealing do they find that idea? And are there other reasons to explain some of those differences? With any kind of piece of research, there's going to be some kind of inherent bias or with how people are giving your information. That's not a fatal flaw. So when we think about this and we think about people answering a survey, that they're giving you their best opinion on what they might do or how they feel about something or how they buy products or interact with them, or they're trying to answer the questions usually in a thoughtful way. But there's always some inherent bias there. You ask someone, how likely are you to buy this product? Well, they'll answer that question thoughtfully and truthfully, but the reality of what they do in market might be very different. So what we find is a lot of times with these questions that if we ask them in a consistent way, if we ask them in a way that allows us to understand, okay, well, I've done this type of research 1,000 times before, then we're able to take that insight and make some adjustments. And we can say, oh, that's where times a lot of more value for us to say, okay, comparing against different pieces of research or comparing against a benchmark or something like that can be very important. But just looking at that number and saying, well, I know that 80% of consumers are going to buy my product. A lot of what's going on there is maybe how you collected the information. And then I talked a little bit about matching the risk with the tool that you're using. So you see that quite a bit, where somebody might be using a very complicated and expensive piece of research to manage maybe a pretty small decision on their business. And in some cases, and vice versa, where they have a really important big decision and they're just trying to check a box by doing some research to address that. So making sure that you're thinking about the business decision you're making, the risk that you're trying to manage, the opportunity you're trying to unlock, and then trying to figure out the right tool for the job. And then this idea of just like churning through research. And this is one of those areas where many of you in a startup environment, every bit of your budget is very precious. So I would suspect that many of you are really going to squeeze as much insight as you can out of every bit of research that you do. When you get into much bigger companies that have larger budgets, you see this where there's one piece of insight that comes out of that research and the rest of it kind of falls on the cutting room floor. And so that's a shame. That a lot of times what I find when I'm working with a company is they might bring me in and ask me to commission some new research or work on a new project. And the first thing we do is like, let's go back and look at all the great work you've already done. And ironically, it's probably I probably will do better myself if I just say, well, let's go execute some new research. But many times you can answer those questions with work that you've already done. And the last thing I'll say, and this is a little bit a longer conversation for another day, but when you think about gathering the information, and this is sort of the distinction between if I'm running some DIY research or if I'm working with a company that's spending a lot of time thinking about this, is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes you kind of get what you pay for in terms of the sample or the people that you're gathering, the survey participants. And I'm seeing this more and more in the work that I'm doing, where I have to be really thoughtful that we are talking to actual consumers and not just some kind of bot that's answering the survey. So for those of you that might be, I mean, this is something that that companies struggle with as you think about digital advertising and you think about people that am I actually serving up my ad to people or am I serving my ad up to a bot with the same problems that you can have with research. And so that's one of those things that as you're working with a vendor or as you're working with a particular study, just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind that what steps are they taking to make sure that you have high confidence in the panel and in the people that you might be interacting with. For many of you, I would think that you're probably in a position where you're saying, okay, some of this sounds great, but I'm looking at research that is sometimes, or I'm getting people, I'm talking to vendors and they're talking about research that's really expensive. And so I get it. I'm on board. I should be answering all these great questions, but I don't have the budget today to be able to tackle all of these. So what could you do in terms of trying to start to do some of these insights on the cheap? So one of the things that you'll find is that a lot of what I'm talking about, you could do yourself. So when we are looking at how do I start to go interact and understand my consumer's path to purchase? Well, as I mentioned before, you can hire companies that'll help you do that, but there's nothing holding you back from going out and talking to your consumers today. There's nothing holding you back like going into a retail environment, asking the shop manager if you can go talk to a few of the consumers about their shopping experience today. So there's lots of ways that you can just roll up your sleeves and start to do this type of work on your own. And there are a variety of companies that offer self-serve survey tools and techniques that are pretty easy to learn and use. And so as you think about answering some of these questions, some of this is stuff you can do yourself. There's a lot of really strong work that are that many times you're talking about the difference between a custom research study, which can be quite expensive, and then syndicated reports or research that can help you answer your business question. And so these reports are tend to be a lot less expensive. So as you think about, I don't know, like a company like Kantar or Nielsen or Ipsos, IRI, others, they many times they might be working with companies and coming up with a study that is catered to the specific needs of your business, answering the specific business question. But if you're really looking at this and saying, hey, some of the points I was talking about before, so working with my client to understand what is the impact of the pandemic on consumer purchase and shopping behavior? Well, the way that we solved that or answered that questions for them is that we went through a few webinars that some of these vendors had put on where they were sharing quite a bit of information. And we subscribed to a $500 report that provided a lot of data on some consumer survey work that they had done that were really directly applicable to the beauty care space. And so that really helped to address that without us starting with a blank sheet of paper and trying to go out and find that research. Your retail and media partners, as you build out those engagements, can be a wealth of information in terms of, especially in syndicated data. So retailers many times will allow you access to your own sales data. Sometimes they'll allow you some level of access on category data and category information. And so this is information that you can go out and acquire without necessarily having to go pay a lot of money to go get a view on what's happening in terms of sales within your market. And many times your media partners, depending on what kind of relationships you have there, they might be subscribing to data. And so a lot of times it's duplicative. If you're subscribing to information or buying data and your media partner is buying it, maybe you're already getting billed for some of that, or you're sharing some of the freight with that. So industry organizations. So I work quite a bit within the outdoor retail industry, and I've had some conversations recently with their small outdoor retailers don't have money to go do a lot of research, but they have industry organizations that are very interested in understanding how do we get together, how do we bring some scale. So thinking about within your industry, are there specific organizations? And many times, if you're connected in those forums, you can raise your hand and say, hey guys, why don't we get together and tackle this particular need? So like in this, not to beat it to death, but in the outdoor industry, I'm working with them to understand how do they think about underserved segments that are not getting in the outdoors today. What are the barriers for different people that feel like, hey, going backpacking, camping, hiking is just not for me? Like what is it that the industry could do differently to cast a much wider net and be more inclusive? And that's a question that is being asked by manufacturers, retailers, a lot of other folks. And there's very little competitive challenges in terms of sharing that information broadly. And that leads to this other idea as well. There are ways to crowdsource some of this research. So there's sites like there's Collaborata, which is literally an area where you can go in and post a topic where you would like to understand if other people would like to work with you to gather that research or information. You can also see where suppliers or where vendors are out there selling that. And you can go in there and go purchase specific syndicated studies from that sort of site. And then the last piece of this too, if you're a small company here in town or you're a startup here in town, we have a lot of really great large companies here in town that do a lot of research and have and are really big fans and cheerleaders of our startup community. And so I would encourage you, and I'm happy to help with some of these connections as well, that if you're working with a consumer group or have a specific business question that ties back to a larger company and you're not directly competing in this space, then they might be willing to share information with you or might be very open to having a sit down and talking a little bit about that. So there's some of the things I talked about before, some of these overarching trends or challenges for an industry. So as you think about the challenges of the pandemic and retail, the great folks at Kroger are probably very willing to sit down with you and talk a little bit about some of those challenges and how you might think about that for your business. So that's something for you to keep in mind, and don't feel like you could go knock on some doors and ask questions. You might be surprised what people are willing to share. So a few things that you can do today, and these are just a few examples, and then I want to shut up to give us time to ask questions and go into more specifics in areas that you might have. But it's you can go out and talk to a consumer today, and it's interesting that I think some people are afraid of consumers and they're afraid of what they're going to say or what they might do, and it's something where you feel out of your element, and that's okay. Like I think there's something inherently valuable in getting a little bit uncomfortable and sitting down and talking with your consumers, and maybe consumers that are very different than you. And so I think it helps you do your job better, and it also gives you a new respect for maybe some of the challenges and opportunities that your consumer has. I'd encourage you to build a learning plan. So some of the things that I was touching on earlier about connecting your business question to what is a consumer insight or consumer question you want to answer. Well, what do you think consumers are doing in the marketplace? Can you hypothesize what that is? And if you gather that information, how would you run your business a little differently? So what action would you take? And then the last piece of this is if you already have some of this research around, like go back and review some of this work. And like I said, it's one of those things as someone who, and even in some cases, you can maybe even reach out to the vendor or reach out to whoever provided you that information if you need them to clarify something. But yeah, I think a lot of times what you see is that we'll buy this piece of research or we'll go get this particular piece of insight. We're all excited about it. We have a big presentation. And then when we're done with it, it kind of just is left in an inbox or left on the shared drive. And you can find that there's actually quite a bit of great insight that you might be able to go back and remember as you're thinking about business questions you might have today. Like, okay, well, did that habits and practices study that we ran some time ago? Might that inform this? Like, there's a lot of value in that. So I've covered a lot of ground here. I've been talking nonstop for the past, call it like 43 minutes. So I appreciate you kind of going along for the ride. I want to stop talking now and open it up to your questions. And I'd ask you to give clarifying questions on some of the stuff that I talked about. If you have specific questions that are relevant to your business, like you can throw those out. And if we can't get in too much detail on a call like this, I'm happy to take those offline as well. So with that, let me pause and
Dirk, I got a couple thrown my way, and then there's one specific one in the chat. Let's start with that one. So first, how would looking at a different demographic group inform kind of your research choices? So say if you wanted to understand how baby boomers did something versus Generation Z, how might you think about different ways of conducting the research? Would you start with media habits? What would your
Yeah, it's a great question and a common one that we all have. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is that anytime that I'm thinking about be it demographics or attitudinal segments or anything like that. It kind of ties back to the point I was making for earlier about segmentation. When I'm doing that, I want to understand differences and I also want to understand similarities because I think that whenever you're looking at that, it's important for you to see like what are these principles that tie us all together. And so I think that's one of the things that before you go too far down this path, like you find that hey, Gen Z and millennials and boomers, they all want this out of the category. So that's one of the things that I first start with. And then importantly, I want to then get into once I kind of level set about this foundational expectations, is it, be it media or product usage or whatever it might be. Then I get into, all right, what are these meaningful differences between these different groups? And when I say meaningful differences, that's kind of the point I was making before about not just chasing the statistical significance around, but I want to see large differences between some of these groups. There's a couple things to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of work. One, you got to have these conversations on the front end of your design. So you need to have a large enough group of people within each of these segments to be able to make comparisons. So, and again, that kind of goes back to the risk you're trying to manage. But if you don't have at least 50 of these people, then I'm skeptical. Some people will say it's like 32 or what have you. For most of the research, I'm going out there and I'm saying, look, if I really want to understand Gen Z, I want to talk to 100 of them or so. But what you're typically doing is you're designing a survey so that you can make those kind of comparisons. You get a really robust base. But as I said before, like make sure that you're not just looking at the differences, but also use that as a great opportunity to understand what ties them together.
Okay. Another question I got through the chat directly was, B2B customer research. There's a lot of layers, right? So there's big companies, small companies. Within the companies, there's this kind of department, this kind of business process. There's, if you're selling software, there's IT that's an influencer. And then you get down to like the really specific person who might be the user. How do you think about prioritizing all those different layers in doing B2B customer research? And then how do you go find those right people? It's easy to find consumers. You can go stand in the aisle at Kroger if you need to. But how do you think about B2B buyers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's different. There are different challenges depending on the specific space that you're playing in. So I've done like quite a bit of work with medical professionals, for instance. And there's a few observations. One is that you would be surprised how willing professionals are to interact and talk with you when you're approaching them with a genuine question about, I am looking to improve the way that I bring my product to market for you. Would you have time to talk to me about that? If you're approaching them in that way, that you'd be surprised how often people are willing to make the time. So I would say that you're absolutely right that it's harder to get a hold of these people. It's harder to track them down. There are some, and I'm happy to take some of this online, but there are ways to go recruit professionals. So there are people that basically you're incentivizing them to come talk to you or incentivizing them to answer a survey. So I've everything from people who are I've done research among farmers, among people who manufacture large equipment and are selling that, or purchasers of IT solutions. And again, like even at a C-suite, you can get a hold of some of those folks. So I would say that it's not easy, but it's definitely possible. And last thing I'd say on that too, John, is that I think the principles are all are similar, where you're still trying to understand what are the drivers of choice within my category, who are those decision makers, do I see any differences between those different groups, and then to your point, like are there forums, are there conferences, are there other areas where I might be able to find them in mass and be able to gather some of their information.
Okay. How would you think about if you're doing concept testing and you have a concept you're excited about, but you really want to keep confidential? How do you think about protecting IP while still getting customer or consumer feedback on an idea?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think a lot of companies don't think enough about. And so there is a risk. So a lot of times what I'll do is that I will usually I'll design into the survey some specific questions or language that as part of a screener that will require us to understand, do they work in a competitive industry? Are these people who I would not want to share the concept with in some material way? And then also there are some restrictions where they will have to basically electronically sign that they are not screen capturing or gathering the information that I'm sharing. So with all that said, if somebody's being nefarious, they can get through all that and they can get access to our information. So you are striking a balance about when are you okay sharing, how much are you okay sharing. But I would encourage you to think about that as part of the design of the survey, and as part of the screener. There are some specific boilerplate language that I could include, or that you usually can include, that will help to screen those folks out. And the last thing I'd say too is that a lot of times the way you craft that will, if you just come out and say, do you work in these kind of industries, then people will try to self-select themselves in because they want the incentive or what have you. There are ways to ask it where you can kind of get a better sense of, like, do these people actually interact in a way with my idea that I would be concerned about? So that's how I typically tackle that problem.
Okay. All right. And this is a great question, and I'm going to give you my bad answers because I'm curious in testing of how out of date I am. So what's a great way of asking a consumer what price they would pay for a product, right? And so my way out of date approach would be, conjoint analysis or max diff, but I'll be fascinated to, how do you think about getting good input on what price people would be to pay without just them saying, oh yeah, the lowest?
Yeah, well, don't sell yourself short, John. Like I do a lot of what I like to encourage people to do is that, what John's talking about here is asking the consumer to we want to understand their choices, and so giving them choices between, here are different products that you might have in the marketplace, and would you be willing to pay this amount for those? And so I think those are very powerful tools. And so I think depending on the category you're entering, depending on how familiar people might be with that category. But I think that choice-based analytics makes a lot of sense. Today, it's getting easier and easier to do virtual interactions with the shelf. And depending on the retail environment that you're looking at, those can be very powerful tools to understand what types of products people might select and understand variances in product. So kind of doing a virtual shelf test is another area that I think can also be very powerful. But I like conjoint, so I think that's a very powerful tool, and one that can really help you understand understand price elasticity. So.
And I would throw out to the audience then, the quality of tools available online to do that sort of stuff is increased massively in the 20 years since I got out of business school. There was my favorite tool ever was Survey Gizmo. It's a software company in Colorado. I think they've changed the name, but you could do really sophisticated analysis with online surveys without ever having to get into the math. They do it all for you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think that's one of those where, and again, with such a large audience, I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of a lot of this, but if you've got questions, this is one of those things where, please feel free to reach out to me. Like, I'm a cheap date, so over a cup of coffee or virtual beer or what have you. Like I think that was, I think it was like, I've met with a client and a friend recently. We were working on understanding sampling effectiveness, and I think that cost him 2 beers. So it's, if you're having some of these questions, feel free to reach out, and if there's more that I can do for you, I'd be happy to. But if it's just like, where should I be looking, or are there other options I should be considering, then I'd be happy to help.
Okay, so one last question then. When you're doing concept testing, if you show somebody the problem that you're trying to solve, does that inherently bias the result?
So if you show someone the problem that you're trying to solve, then you have to think about, so to answer the question, and I think I understand the question. I hate, like with chat, it's hard to ask a clarifying question, but I think what you're poking at is that you do have to be very thoughtful about what you're introducing and where you're doing it within that piece of research. So if you're trying to understand, for example, awareness of a brand in marketplace. Well, you can't talk about brands right before you ask that question. Similarly, as you think about this, what I try to do if you're doing concept exposure, you got to do that really early. Like you got to be that's one of the first things you're doing. So if you're asking a bunch of screening questions that get people thinking about the category in a kind of in a type 2 way instead of thinking about it in much more of a of maybe a type 1 way, then that can be something that can also bias your survey participants. So I would say that the key with a lot of concept testing is make sure that you're doing it early and make sure that you're being very thoughtful about the questions you're using as screeners, and are they setting some expectation about the concept or about the importance of elements that you might put in the concept. The reason you're asking lots of questions about a particular benefit, or asking lots of questions about how people might struggle with buying a product at retail or whatever, and then you're showing them a concept. Well, lo and behold, if your concept's solving that problem, you just ask them 10 questions about the problem, that can kind of impact how they view your concept.